welcome to our Flinders University Investigator Lecture for 2020. We're absolutely delighted to host tonight's event, and can I say, in what is an iconic Adelaide institution, and it's just so wonderful, and I'd like to acknowledge Douglas Goutier, the CEO of the Adelaide Festival Centre, who's here tonight. This has just been a wonderful refurbishment for the City of Adelaide. So for those of you who I've not met personally, my name is Callista Tu. I am the Executive Director for Engagement and Advancement at Flinders University, and I have the delight of being the MC for tonight's event. So we are delighted that you were able to join us this evening in person. We did, as I said before, we had about 700 RSVPs, that clearly the theatre can hold so many more than that, but 700 tonight, socially distanced, is wonderful to have you all here this evening. I would very much like to begin by acknowledging the key people who are here in this audience tonight, but actually with such a crowd here, I will just move straight to a welcome and say thank you very much for joining us on a Thursday evening in Adelaide. At the outset, I acknowledge that today we meet on the lands of the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship and the custodianship of the Adelaide region, a rich cultural heritage that lives on in the Kaurna people today. In a moment, I will invite Kaurna Elder Uncle Lewis O'Brien AO, to welcome us to country. I'm also pleased to let you know that actually this year, Uncle Lewis O'Brien has recently been appointed as one of 3 senior elders to Flinders University, joining our 2 senior elders at our Darwin and Alice Springs campuses, Uncle Richard Furjo and Auntie Pat Miller AO. So just before I introduce Uncle Lewis, a couple of housekeeping points. In the case of emergency, and we're not expecting any fire drills tonight, please follow the green exits and our event staff will lead you to safety. Bathrooms are located in the lobby. Now, we actually don't want you to turn off your mobile phones, so if you do have one, can you take it out, please, and turn it to silent? We have a Twitter hashtag tonight, #FlindersInvestigator, and we'd love you to tweet, because actually if you tweet a question while the panel is talking, that's your opportunity to ask our panel or our guest speaker a question tonight. So I'd now like to welcome Kaurna Elder Uncle Lewis O'Brien AO to welcome us to country this evening. Thank you, Uncle Lewis.
Marawitjanga, Kaurna Miana, Nai Wangani, Mani the Bundigani Atana. Naibiriko, Mankalankalo, Tandanya, Mianaku. Nature Yungandalia, Nature Yakanandalia, Padni Adlu Wadu. On behalf of the Kaurna people, I welcome you all to Kaurna country, and I do this ambassador of the Adelaide Plains people. My brothers, my sisters, let's walk together in harmony. I should tell you a little bit about my life. I was born on Point Pearce Mission, and while I was there, my uncle took me out and showed me the country, and he said, they're filled in the rivers and creeks, he said, cut down the trees, he said, they've altered the country. This was our university. He said, now you'll have to go to the university on the hill, and that's where I am now at Flinders, which he forecast. That was in 1940, he said that, which is rather remarkable. And then he told me that the next step, he said, we ran conferences in this country for thousands of years with the Nukununa, Nudri, the Kaurna, Narunga and Nurundri met together for 2 moons. And they came to us for education because we taught them about thinking and thinking twice, and so to be lateral in our thinking because we were in a difficult country, we had floods and droughts. And then we found an extra step when they came to us. When they came to us, we found that every language group came and knowledge that no one else possessed. And that's the gift of languages. People think you can get rid of a language, you can, but look what you lose, nearly an encyclopedia. And so we were the educators, we educated them in thinking, but then we had the Arabana were our philosophers, and you can read a book, Being, Doing and Knowing in Arabana. And then the Gunai were our spiritual people. They taught us all to have a word for creator, and our word for creator is Pingulingula. And so we had a spiritual, philosophical way of living, a very simple life, but we weren't simple people. We were rather complex, because we became complex because we had 250 nations sharing knowledge with us. And we had a nice little phrase to cover that, Nodlu Kamanka, we'll do it now together. And so we did things together straight away, And so we learned to exchange knowledge. And so we had knowledge about weather, because I told the fire brigade once, when the Drosera blooms in profusions, fires will follow. And they look at you and think, why the Drosera? Well, the Drosera needs a lot of rain, therefore it tells you there'll be a lot of undergrowth, therefore you've got to get rid of it, because then it'll help to stop fires starting. And so you have to plan ahead, and that's what our people did. You can't stop fires, because something will start them off, but you can reduce the effects by reducing the amount of fuel to burn. And then you can't stop droughts, but you can watch where you cut down trees and where you plant them, because we learn about the wear factor. Where you plant them will make a difference in where you let them grow. You can't just indiscriminately cut down trees, it's silly. And we hear people saying plant 1 million trees, and we go, what sort of strategy is that? We say where you plant them is the important issue. And our people told us something, they lived in Penindi on the Ayers Peninsula. And the uncle told me, he said, when they cut down the trees at Cummings, the rainfall fell. So in 2014, we got the kids in the school at Cummings to plant 1,400 trees in their schoolyard, because that's where the trees should be. And the principal did a wonderful thing there that before we got there. Fire brigade was going to cut down all the gum trees in front of the school. She said, no, you don't. You leave them there. And it's lucky she did. Because the rainfall was dropping, because we had a mathematician work with us. He told us it was so slight, humans can't see it. And now I think the rainfall is starting to increase a bit because of those trees. And so you can see there's things we can do and share with each other in life, and that's what life should be about. Let's share our combined knowledge together and make this a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Lewis, for your words of welcome and your ongoing cultural support. So I've learnt a word tonight, 2 words Uncle Lewis gave me earlier tonight, and I think it's a wonderful theme for tonight. Nadu Kumanka. We do it now together. So why is tonight's event, the Investigator Lecture, called the Investigator Lecture? Well, it's not actually because of the researchers and the investigators that we actually have on campus at Flinders University. This annual lecture is actually named after the ship, the Investigator, that Matthew Flinders commanded on his 3rd and most famous voyage in 1801. This voyage circumnavigated mainland Australia and resulted in the first comprehensive maps of the continent's coastline. But while Matthew Flinders is very well known, well, mostly in Australia, and is widely celebrated for his achievements, less is known about the Aboriginal man Bungaree, who was instrumental to the success of the voyage. Bungaree, a Ku-ring-gai man from now what is called the Broken Bay area of New South Wales, was a noted community leader and powerful identity. He sailed with Flinders from 1798 to 1803 in the role of interpreter and guide. So in Matthew Flinders' diaries, he credited Bungaree as a worthy and brave fellow who saved the expedition on multiple occasions. At Flinders University, we recognise the pivotal role Bungaree had in Matthew Flinders' success. So I would like to welcome President and Vice-Chancellor of Flinders University, Professor Colin Sterling, to deliver opening remarks.
Thank you, Callista, and thank you, Uncle Lewis, for that wonderful welcome to country. Welcome everyone and our VIP guests, ladies and gentlemen, our speakers, our panel members, our speaker today and our panel members. Welcome all to this event and welcome everyone here in person to this magnificent reimagining of Her Majesty's Theatre. And Douglas Gautier and his team, Douglas being, of course, a member of council at Flinders University, but Douglas has to be congratulated with his team on this wonderful reimagining of this terrific theatre. And of course, I'm sure, like all of us, he's very much looking forward to the day that it can be full to the brim, as I'm sure it will be very soon, with audiences to enjoy the events here. It's wonderful to see so many people who are joining Flinders University this evening to explore some big ideas on some of probably the biggest issue that we face together in our world. Firstly, though, I too would like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge the Kaurna people's ongoing spiritual connection to this land. It's especially pertinent in the context of today's forum to acknowledge the oldest continuous living culture on our planet, a culture whose relationship with the earth is one of custodianship and stewardship, maintaining a sustainable and symbiotic relationship with the natural world. Unfortunately, as we will hear this evening, the science tells us that modern humankind's relationship with the planet is a very different one. Interestingly, as we all recognize, I would imagine, climate change has still struggled yet to gain the traction that it deserves. Yes, vested interests and yes, some climate deniers are partly to blame, but there's also been a failure of our imagination. We live in a complex, interconnected world, and it's sometimes hard to see how any of us can make a meaningful difference. Yet we can, and it starts with small steps. And I'm very proud to say that at Flinders University, we've begun taking those steps and have a clear goal to reduce our environmental footprint. Our sustainability plan sets out a range of principles, priorities, and goals that range from small, student-led initiatives to bold, large-scale projects. For example, we've recently transformed the way we collect and manage waste on our campus, resulting in our organic waste being recycled on campus through student-led market gardens. We have a renewable energy power station on campus, currently comprising over 7,000 panels and delivering 20% of our annual electricity needs. We're expanding this solar farm and have been investigating the deployment of large-scale batteries that would allow us to manage our energy even more closely and contribute to the diversity and stability of the South Australian power grid. Indeed, we expect our main campus to be running on 100% renewable energy by next year. The sum benefit of our on-campus and indeed off-campus development of renewable energies will effectively eliminate over 60% of the university's previous carbon emissions. And we are also now looking at ways to reduce the remaining 40%. To that end, we've recently installed 13 electric vehicle charging stations on the campus, and we're shifting our fleet of university vehicles to all electric by the end of the year. So we can make a difference when we commit to change and we deliver small steps. But many fail to start because it feels all too hard. Indeed, one of the greatest failures in imagination has been the sense that the changes we make are too small to be meaningful, that we cannot change the way things are done, because the world is too big, too complex, too interconnected, too interdependent. In that context, I'll look at the experience of another challenge that we're facing, COVID-19, and I do wonder if it might prove to be a game changer. Now, that's not to welcome COVID-19, far from it, and clearly the increasing death toll from COVID-19 is a growing human tragedy. The economic impact of COVID-19 on millions of people around the world will resonate for years and perhaps decades to come. Yet it has shown us something. It has shown us that when we hit the pause button on our frantic lifestyle, the world keeps spinning, the tides keep time, and we've found new ways, different ways, and are still finding new ways to live and do business. When Greta Thunberg sailed to the US across the Atlantic to avoid air travel, perhaps even her most ardent admirers would have wondered how realistic the alternative to air travel really would be. And in that pre-COVID world, We already had access to Zoom, to Microsoft Teams, to WebEx, and other platforms are available. But most of us still flew to attend face-to-face meetings because, frankly, that's the way we did things. But look at us now. How many of you are familiar, or how many are not familiar, I should ask, with the phrase, "you're still on mute"? We all feel like we may have spent too long on some of those conferencing sessions, and yet, for example, this evening, our keynote speaker will deliver his keynote to us from his home in Melbourne, where we wish him well, as all Victorians have been dealing with the complexities of the COVID outbreak there. Now, I'm not suggesting that Zoom can replace all face-to-face meetings. It can't. But I, for one, cannot imagine that I will travel as much as I once did, since video conferencing is clearly here to stay. Travel is only one element of the re-evaluation of our lifestyle, so perhaps we do have an opportunity to think big about the combined effect of the many little things that we can actually do as we realize that our world needs a new normal. 2020 has been a year in which communities around the world have demonstrated what we can achieve when we work together in common purpose. And it is my great hope that this year may also prove to have been a watershed moment in defining what we're capable of as we tackle the biggest challenge of all, climate change. So I'm very much looking forward to this evening's presentation, to hearing from our keynote speaker this evening, Professor David Karoly, and then hearing from our wonderful panel members as they provide us their perspectives on the most recent climate science and, of course, their vision for the future. I do hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Colin. So our university's namesake, Captain Matthew Flinders, was driven by the pursuit of knowledge and a greater understanding of our world. Matthew Flinders' precision was so profound that the maps based on his 1801-1802 voyage with Bungaree are still used in some of the waters to the north of Australia today. Our keynote speaker this evening is also dedicated to expanding our knowledge and understanding of the world, contributing to and instigating extensive discussion and ongoing positive change around the world. Professor David Karoly FAA is the leader of the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub in the Australian Government's National Environmental Science Program based within the CSIRO. He is an honorary professor at the University of Melbourne and an internationally recognised expert on climate change and variability. Professor Karoly was a member of the National Climate Science Advisory Committee during 2018 and 2019. And prior to this, from 2012 to 2017, he was a member of the Climate Change Authority, where he provided advice to the Australian Government on climate change responses, including targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. He has been involved in the assessment reports for the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, the most recent, which will be released in 2021, but also for the years of 2001, 2007 and 2014. Professor Karoly has also been recognised for his work with numerous awards and prizes, including the Meisinger Award, the Eureka Prize, Morton Medal, and is also a fellow of both the American Meteorological Society and the Australian Academy of Science. So, as Colin said, Professor Karoly is presenting to us live from the safe confines of his home, where I think now you're just about to be, or you're able to have much more freedom as lockdown is being reduced, which we're very pleased to see. Following this and the keynote, we'll be joined by a panel where we'll be able to interact and ask questions and hear a little bit more about climate change and the research that's being done at Flinders University, and also hear from our youth voice. Please join me now in giving Professor Karoly a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Callista, and really it's both an honour and a pleasure to have been invited to present this Investigator lecture And it's also, as Professor Sterling said, a really interesting experiment to do this while also saving my personal greenhouse gas emissions by giving it as a virtual lecture to such a big audience in Adelaide while I'm sitting at home here. And the other thing I want to do is also acknowledge the important contributions and the acknowledgement and welcome to country from Uncle Lewis. I'm sitting here in the traditional lands of the Bunurong people here in southeastern Melbourne, but I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of all the 250 nations of traditional custodians across Australia, and also recognise that this continuous Indigenous knowledge that has grown over many thousands of generations in Australia, the traditional owners and custodians have survived a massive extent of climate change because they're the only traditional custodians, traditional people who have survived from the depths of the last ice age and how it affected Australia to the current interglacial period with more than 5 degrees of warming across Australia from 20,000 years ago to the present warm period that we are living through. More than 100 meters of sea level rise. And we can learn enormously from the current custodians of the lands across Australia. We can learn from our Indigenous peoples how they manage the country sustainably over many thousands of generations, because what we will see is that the projections for the next 100 years are another 5 degrees of global warming unless we change what we are doing in terms of the use of fossil fuels. And I'll talk more about that. But what I want to do is, first of all, acknowledge Uncle Lewis. And then finally, I also want to acknowledge that the prior investigator lecturer 10 years ago was Tim Flannery. Tim Flannery gave an investigator lecture here at Flinders University in 2010 around climate change, and he was alerting the listeners then to the importance of addressing climate change. And I have used an even earlier warning that came around climate change from a United Nations Foundation report, and that's where I borrowed this title. Managing the Unavoidable and Avoiding the Unmanageable is the title of their report from 2007. And what I'm going to do is try to talk about these two separate components, why we need to manage the unavoidable impacts of climate change and avoid the unmanageable impact by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so what I'm going to do is talk about these changes that we're going to see, but I'm going to give a summary. And the summary that I'm going to give is this from this United Nations Foundation report, the 3 dot points. They will end up being exactly the same summary dot points that are relevant now as they were in 2007. Their report was titled Confronting Climate Change, Avoiding the Unmanageable and Managing the Unavoidable. And what they said was it is critically important to look at climate change because it is driven by human activity, the combustion of fossil fuels and deforestation, and it is a growing threat that affects both developing countries and industrial nations alike. It is not just poor countries, but developed countries. And what we know is that Australia is dramatically at risk from climate change. We also know from their conclusion that significant harm from climate change is already occurring, was already occurring in 2007, and that further damages are a certainty. We still know that. And the challenge in addressing climate change that they alerted us to in 2007 is how to limit climate change from becoming a catastrophe. And what I'm going to do is update the science from 2007 to the present by first looking at climate change in Australia and then looking at what we need to do to avoid the unmanageable impacts of climate change, some of which were experienced in 2019 and 2020 in Australia. So let me first look at the observed climate change. And what we see here is the increase in temperatures across Australia. The red bars are warmer temperatures than the average, and the average in this case is the average for the period from 1960 to 1990, roughly in the middle of this period here. And what we see is that there's been an increase in temperatures from around half a degree cooler than the 1960 to 1990 average to now warming of more than 1 degree above the 1960 to 1990 average, or a warming of 1.5 degrees. What's critically important, and if you want to go back when you get access to these slides to the global average temperature that was shown on the first graphic, you'll see that the global average temperatures have warmed only 1 degree over the last 100 years. But what we've seen in Australia is already a warming, which is about 50% larger than that. 1.5 degrees of warming over the last 100 years, a warming across the whole of Australia by an average of 1.5 degrees. What we see is a relatively uniform warming, less warming around the coastline, more warming inland, and that's what we expect when we look at year-to-year temperature variations. There's large year-to-year variability. But if we want to look at something that is equally important to the temperature change, it's the rainfall change, because water resources are critical to agriculture, water resources are critical to natural ecosystems, and water resources are critical to the water that we need to drink as well. And I'm going to show two separate graphs here. On the left-hand side is the cool season rainfall, and everyone in Adelaide, when you look at the recent rainfall changes, what this graphic shows is the last 20 years of rainfall from 1998 to 2017 relative to all 20-year periods from 1900 to the present. The red colours show the record lowest rainfall, and we see that throughout much of southwestern Australia. In South Australia, we see rainfall which is in the lowest 10% of years, and we also see through much of Victoria and again the regions in southern Queensland and southern New South Wales, record low rainfall. So what we see is lower rainfall, record low rainfall and extreme low rainfall in the most recent 20 years relative to the other 20-year periods in the winter and cool season. What about if we look at the warm season, particularly in the rainy period in Northern Australia? Now we see blues and record high rainfall in the most recent 20 years. We get very different rainfall changes in the warm season relative to the cool season. And what we're seeing is, in fact, the average rainfall across Australia has increased, not declined. And that's because the increases in rainfall in Northern Australia, where we've seen these higher than average rainfall, has dominated the most 20 years. And we've seen an increase on rainfall. The wet season rainfall in Northern Australia is much greater than the wet season rainfall in Southern Australia. So there's big differences in the rainfall patterns. More rainfall in the warm season, less rainfall in Southern Australia in the cool season. Well, what do we expect to happen in the future? Well, this is now projected temperature changes, projected global warming changes relative to the 2000s. And you've got to remember that this graphic is taken relative to 1986 to 2005, or centered on the decade of the 1990s. And we're looking at projections for increases in greenhouse gases that are effectively business as usual, a mid-range estimate of 4 degrees of warming relative to the 1990s. But actually in the 1990s, we'd already seen nearly 0.8 of a degree of warming relative to the 1990s. So this 4 degrees relative to the 1990s is more like 4.5 to 5 degrees of warming. And there's an uncertainty range. We can't be absolutely certain because it depends on the uncertainties in the climate system as well as what we do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And what we see is that if we look at the upper range, which only spans 2/3 of the probability distribution, there's another 15% or so up here, we're actually up at 5.5 degrees. And 5.5 degrees relative to 2000 is actually more than 6 degrees of global warming. And that is still a possibility. 6 degrees of global warming is more like 9 degrees of warming in Australia. That is an unimaginable different planet. With 6 degrees of global warming and 9 degrees of warming in Australia. The planet has not seen that level of warming for more than 10 million years. Well, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is rapid emission reductions, in which case we have a 50% chance of warming less than 2 degrees in this lower blue scenario. But actually, there's a 50% chance of warming greater than 2 degrees. And I will talk more about what this means in terms of the Paris Agreement. But we still have a 50% risk of warming greater than 2 degrees. Remember, we've already experienced 1 degree of global warming. So what does it mean for changes across Australia? Well, in that scenario of continued warming, even with 2 degrees of global warming, I'm going to go around this and look at the range of impacts across Australia. And it's important to understand that these are projected impacts. But unfortunately, there are also the impacts we've experienced across Australia in the most recent decade. These are the changes that we're seeing already. Increases in global average temperatures, increases in sea level, and it's projected to continue to increase. We've seen 20 centimetres of sea level rise. The projected increases, even for 2 degrees of warming, at the end of this century are more than 50 centimetres of sea level rise, in addition to the 20 centimetres we've experienced already. Warming of the ocean waters around Australia and acidification of the ocean waters due to the higher CO2. This leads to massive impacts on all marine ecosystems, but particularly on coral reefs. And that's why we've seen continued and recurring coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. And the Great Barrier Reef, even for 2 degrees of warming, is at serious risk of collapse. We're seeing, much as experienced in Adelaide and throughout Kangaroo Island, we've seen continued increases in heat waves, more hot days and fewer cool days. We've seen decreases in the winter rainfall across southern Australia, leading to more droughts. We've seen exactly harsher bushfire weather that affected South Australia, affected Victoria, as well as southern New South Wales and Queensland in 2019 and 2020, but also in many other periods. Unfortunately, as we saw at the end of the extreme fire conditions in early 2020, we've then seen extreme rainfall and flash flooding and hailstorms associated with the more moisture and the more thunderstorms that we see associated with the higher climate. And the one piece of good news is that tropical cyclones, the number of tropical cyclones is projected to decrease. And so that's good news for Northern Australia. The bad news, however, that goes with that is that these tropical cyclones are likely to increase in intensity. So what do we need to do? Well, what we need to do is to shift away from this graphic that shows the projected changes in greenhouse gas emissions from a business as usual scenario where we've got more than 50 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide from human activity in 2020. That's what we're already seeing, increasing to more than 100 billion tonnes per year of greenhouse gas emissions, primarily from burning fossil fuels and industrial activity. What we need to do if we want to stabilise temperatures across the globe, we have to go to zero net emissions of greenhouse gases. And this is zero net emissions across all sorts of activities. So what are we seeing? Well, in Paris in 2015, all countries agreed to limit their greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, leading up to Paris, we saw a stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions. This is not all sources of greenhouse gas emissions. This is greenhouse gas emissions just from carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels through transport, from electricity generation and industrial activity. There are other sources of greenhouse gases from deforestation and also other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide that contribute to that net source of fossil fuels. Unfortunately, after 2015, we saw actually an acceleration of growth. And unfortunately, in 2019, we set a new record high in greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuels. I need to speed up, so let me look at what are the conclusions from the most recent science. And this is my next to last slide. And I'm going to go around this like a clock face, and I hope that you're going to be able to read the graphics, and I'll speak through them. The most recent 5 years set a new record for observed temperatures across the whole globe of now in 2016 and 15, 1.1 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. So yes, we've seen record high temperatures globally, now 1.1 degree above pre-industrial levels. And because of this ongoing global warming, the climate impacts that we're seeing, not only in Australia, but around the world, are hitting harder and faster than had been predicted more than a decade ago. Or in that report, what we now know is that there's been a 2% per year annual growth in greenhouse gas emissions over the last 5 years, and we set a new record high in 2019 of greenhouse gas emissions. So that means that greenhouse gas emissions are in fact unlikely to peak in 2020, although they will fall associated with coronavirus in 2020, they're likely to continue to grow as emissions from economic activity continue to grow as the economy recovers in 2021 and 2022. We expect the peak of global emissions will not now occur until 2030. And what we need to do if we want to achieve even 2 degrees of global warming and limit global warming to 2 degrees, we need to treble the current country commitments to limitations of greenhouse gases in all countries around the world. Countries have committed to reduce their emissions, but the best estimate is that even if we meet all those emissions, we're going to end up with global warming of 3.5 degrees by the end of this century. So we need to treble the emissions reduction commitments across all countries. And that means for Australia, we would need to treble the Australian commitment. Australia's got a commitment of 26 to 28% by 2030. That means we have to achieve in Australia a commitment of the order of 75 to 80% emission reductions in Australia by 2030. That is not the current Australian government target, but that is what the best science says. And if we're going to do that, we have to achieve these emission reductions in all sectors, in electricity generation, in transport, in agriculture, in industry, and in buildings. Everything we need to do needs to be done in terms of emission reductions. So look, the human influence on the climate system is clear, and the more that we allow global warming to continue, the more will be the severe and irreversible impacts in all areas, in impacts on human health, in impacts on populations, in impacts on sea level rise, in impacts on ecosystems, in changes in agriculture. We have known this. It's just the same conclusions from the 2007 report. We just know that we've lost time in addressing climate change. We know how to fix climate change now by transitioning to a zero carbon economy, and we can do it and build a more sustainable future. What we also know from the coronavirus is that reductions in economic activity, reductions in transport lead to rapid and large emission reduction. What we're going to do now is transition from me speaking to a video that I made on behalf of the Australian Academy of Science on the coronavirus impacts on 2020 emission reductions. So let's now transition to that slide, and then I will come back again as part of the panel. Thanks a lot.
Hello, I'm Michelle Tapper with the latest from Science. There's been a huge reduction in greenhouse gas emissions since the COVID-19 pandemic was declared in March this year. As multiple countries began lockdowns and border closures, energy demands around the world were reduced. Planes stopped flying, people stayed home, and there were less cars on the road. So what was the impact on our carbon dioxide emissions? Well, here to explain the details is Academy Fellow and one of Australia's leading climate scientists, Professor David Karoly. He is also the leader of the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub at the CSIRO. Hi David, thanks for joining us.
Hi Michelle.
How significant have the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions been since the lockdowns began?
The reductions have been very significant. There have been major reductions in carbon dioxide emissions associated with burning fossil fuels from a number of different sectors because of the massive reductions in economic activity and transport usage around the world.
Research has just been released with data from 69 countries that represent 85% of the world's population. What does that research show?
This research shows what's happened in April and May, early May, in terms of the reductions in emissions essentially across the world. But it focuses on the changes in fossil fuel-related carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon dioxide is the biggest contributor to increases in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere associated with human activity, and they have plummeted. In early April, the emissions have fallen by about 17% on a daily basis relative to the previous year, 2019. And that 17% reduction in emissions is equivalent to how emissions were way back 14 years ago in 2006. So there was a major reduction in emissions.
Those are some pretty significant reductions, and we've seen some huge impacts around the world, like less pollution in big cities, even clean water in places like the Venice canals. What other improvements have we seen globally?
Look, what we've seen associated with the reductions in using fossil fuels for producing electricity, coal-fired power stations have essentially produced less air pollution. Road transport is the other major sector that's led to reductions in fossil fuel use for cars, for trucks, for road transport, and that has meant less air pollution. And what we've seen is around the world, in addition to the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, we've also seen major improvements in air quality or reductions in air pollution, particularly in urban areas, but also in areas where air pollution occurs associated with, for instance, generating electricity or associated with industrial activity.
Now, we know that many countries are still in lockdown, but in some countries, like Australia, restrictions are being eased. Do you think these short-term benefits will have any long-lasting impact, or will we go back to where we were as soon as the world starts up again?
Look, that's a really good question, and it's unclear exactly how different countries will progress, but this study has looked at that in terms of what the current reductions in emissions might mean for the rest of 2020. And what they've estimated is that if the restrictions continue throughout 2020, perhaps in a slightly reduced way, that there will be reductions in the global emissions for the whole of 2020 by around about 7%. over the whole of 2020, whereas if, for instance, the industrial activity and economic activity is returning to a more normal level, we're likely to find that over 2020 as a whole, there would be about 4% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions in the whole of 2020 relative to 2019. So uncertain estimates, but definitely a reduction in the whole of year carbon dioxide emissions associated with human activity.
So that is a sliver of good news in what is a bleak time for pretty much everyone around the world at the moment. But do you think that people can use this opportunity to transition to a zero emissions economy?
What happens in the future really depends upon how countries use the economic stimulus packages to get out of the current depressed economic conditions. Some countries are arguing and using the economic stimulus to transition their transport activities, their economic activity, particularly in terms of transitioning to zero carbon energy sources for greater use of renewable power, greater use of active transport like bicycles and cycling, or even to transition to electric vehicles, as long as the electricity that's used to charge the electric vehicles comes from renewable or zero carbon energy sources. So there is an opportunity to use this transition, this economic stimulus packages, to rapidly transition to a zero carbon economy around the world. And that would then lead to massive long-term reductions in greenhouse gas emissions.
Is there anything else that you hope that people and policymakers can learn from this pandemic with regards to climate change?
Look, there are a whole series of things that we can learn, and the most important one, in my view, is that although emissions fall at present, actually the carbon dioxide concentration will continue to increase in 2020 because emissions are not falling to zero. What we know in terms of meeting the commitments of the Paris Agreement, which is seeking to limit global warming to under 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, what we need to do is to reduce our emissions by 3 to 7% every year from now until 2030 and beyond, if we're to have a good hope of limiting global warming to 2 degrees. And we also know that even in 2020, with this essentially 4 to 7% emission reductions, actually carbon dioxide concentrations will continue to increase, global temperatures will continue to increase, and that's very likely to continue throughout the period from now to 2030 and beyond, unless we rapidly transition to a zero carbon economy.
And is it too late to do so?
It is not too late to do so. We still have the opportunities of transitioning as quickly as possible to a zero carbon economy. We may be too late to limit global warming to 2 degrees, but everything that we do to limit greenhouse gas emissions will reduce the level of global warming that will impact all people and all ecosystems and the environments all around the world. We know that until we reach zero net emissions, global warming will continue, and that is going to happen until we go to net zero emissions.
Well, it's good to know that there is still hope and that we do have the tools and resources to tackle climate change, but I think it's pretty obvious it's going to take a global and combined effort to do so. Thank you so much for your insights and your time today, Professor David Karoly.
You're most welcome, Michelle.
And don't forget, for regular video updates from the Australian Academy of Science, make sure to follow us on social media. I'm Michelle Tapper. See you soon.
So thank you very much, Professor Karoly, for what was not only a very informative presentation and video, but also a very sobering one. So it just goes to show that we've got a long way to go individually and collectively. So to continue the discussion, I'm delighted to introduce our very own Professor John Long, who will facilitate the panel discussion. And a reminder to tweet using the hashtag Flinders Investigator. Many of you are already. I've been watching the Twitter profile going on, just to ask a question, and Professor John Long will pick that up as we go. John is a strategic professor in paleontology at Flinders University. His recent major papers focus on the big issues in vertebrate evolution, like how breathing and sex first evolved in mammals and animals, probably mammals and animals, and how our hands evolved from fish fins. He has authored over 360 publications and some 26 books, with 10 papers in the celebrated peer-reviewed journals of Science and Nature. In 2014, he was awarded the Eureka Medal from the Royal Society of South Australia, and in 2011, he received the Research Medal from the Royal Society of Victoria. Joining Professor Karoly on the panel is also our very own Dr. Cassandra Starr and Doha Khan. Cassandra is a Professor of Public Policy and lead of the Climate and Sustainability Policy Research Group at Flinders University. Her research focuses on the interface between politics and the policy process and how this impacts upon environmental policy. She is interested in the ways different stakeholders shape the climate agenda and is currently researching climate adaptation and resilience in both national and international contexts. Doha Khan, and many of you might recognise Doha because over the last couple of years she's had quite a profile in Adelaide. Doha is actually in her final year of high school, and I'd have to say thank you very much. It's a particular thank you because in this end of year period where it's exam and assessments, Doha's taken the time to be with us here tonight. Doha was involved in co-founding the South Australian branch of the School Strike for Climate movement, which was inspired by Greta Thunberg. She played a leading role in organising the Adelaide Global Climate Strike events through 2018 and 2019, which most recently saw close to 20,000 South Australians take to the streets in support of action on climate change. She's currently engaged in mentoring and building the capacity of student climate activists in Adelaide and is a student at Martin Senior College. And we look forward to seeing whatever comes after this year. John, Cassandra and Doha, welcome. And I'll leave you to it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so at this stage we're welcoming questions from the audience. Just tweet through some questions you'd like to ask David or the panel. And in the meantime, if questions are not coming in, maybe we can ask David some questions. And David, I'd like to start by, I have a geological background, and people that are in the field of geology sometimes have some different views about climate change. And one of them is about where emissions come from in nature, in terms of like degassing of the mantle and the earth itself. So 55 million years ago, for example, we had a massive rise in temperature, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, where global temperatures went up by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius in about 1,000 years. So how much of the greenhouse gases are naturally contributed from the Earth? Do we know this figure today?
We do, and there are in fact very good observational data sets that allow us to monitor the global greenhouse gas emissions month to month, and now using satellite data day to day in terms of their sources in different locations and how they vary from year to year over the last 100 years and even earlier, because we can also extract longer term records of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas concentrations from ice cores. What we do know is that in fact the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions are not from human activity on an annual basis. The largest sources are associated with vegetation decay from the land surface, from plants decaying, as well as from emissions from the surface layers in the ocean. And both ocean emissions and vegetation and land surface emissions are much, much larger than human emissions, but those emissions are also taken back up as part of the natural carbon cycle, taken back up into the ocean and taken back up into vegetation, so that there's been a natural balance over much of the last 1,000 years, where until the last about 200 years ago, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere over the last 1,000 years. They've been very stable between about 280 parts per million in the atmosphere and stayed very stable for 1,000 years and longer. So we know that there have been natural large variations. The natural variations have been in balance. And then something happened about 150 to 200 years ago associated with the extraction of coal and the burning of fossil fuels. Coal is the first fossil fuel, leading to increases in greenhouse gas emissions from human activity. And now we know that the increase in carbon dioxide from its pre-industrial level of 280 parts per million to the current levels, which are 410 parts per million, are much, much greater, led to a change in that carbon cycle balance. And now we know that the increases are due to burning fossil fuels and land clearing and are not due to the natural emissions.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions coming in? Come on, guys, send us some questions. Hashtag Flinders Investigator. I'd like to ask the rest of our panel, would you like to ask David a question? Anything?
Well, I guess one of the things I'd be interested in, David, is your thoughts on how exactly we can engage the community and engage our politicians and policymakers in that commitment to a zero carbon economy.
Look, that's a really good question. And, you know, my experience in engaging with a range of different people is very much that what we need to do is to think about what their interests and their values are, because it's by engaging in their interests and values that we're able to, if you like, point out what for them is important. And we know that for many people, there are large differences in what their interests are, what their values are, but we know that climate change is likely to impact all of those interests and values, whether it's changes in natural ecosystems, impacts on human health, impacts on water resources, impacts on agriculture and food supply. It's by thinking about the climate change impacts on the areas that people are interested in that will attract their attention, because we also know that climate change is going to lead to changes in jobs and will impact some jobs more than others.
Okay. Doha, as leader of an activist sort of group here in Adelaide, would you like to ask David something, or do you have, how do you think the best way we should approach change in our society?
That is an interesting question. Well, ideally, change should be inspired by the facts, and scientists like David, they've spent years highlighting and conveying these facts to decision makers. And so it's actually quite interesting to hear from David, because as an activist, I spend so much time repeating, facts that his studies have found, only for them to fall on deaf ears. So, I guess just to follow up on Cassandra's question, I'd be interested to know the work that the scientific community has been doing to engage decision makers,
Okay, David, did you catch that?
I apologise for my having to step out for a second, because I realised that it was getting dark on the screen. It's half an hour later here in Melbourne than it is in Adelaide, and the sunlight has dropped. But anyhow, I've got the power turned on. We have 100% renewable electricity in my house here. But to answer the question, look, the scientists are actively trying to use the science information, like I've summarised here, to try to communicate that as effectively as possible in language that is relatively simple, not to, oversimplify it, but to present that information to community groups, to industry and business groups, to present it to the state governments, the federal government, to show them that there are opportunities to transition to a zero carbon economy, but that also without that transition, the impacts of climate change will get much worse.
Okay. Now, I want to ask the audience a question. Has anyone sent a question through? Okay, so I want to ask our technical people, Mark, at the back, why aren't I getting them on my computer? Because we want to ask David some questions. Can somebody help me with that, one of the technical crew? Because I'm not getting any messages coming through on the Teams that's set up here.
To the Wi-Fi?
Sorry?
Connected to the Wi-Fi?
Yeah, it's connected to the Wi-Fi. It is indeed connected. So we set this up previously so that the audience could send questions through and then I would address them to the panel.
So I think over the last couple of months, we've all become very used to technical glitches, which I think is what we're experiencing tonight. Luckily enough, I have an iPhone or a mobile, I'm not plugging Apple.
Yep.
And I have a couple of questions here I thought I'd ask. Is that okay, John?
Yeah, take over, please.
Great.
Yep.
So I have a question here from Jordan Bell. I'm writing a book about climate change for children. Can you suggest some practical, meaningful and effective actions kids can take to combat climate change? Recycle doesn't seem like it's going to cut it anymore. So I'm going to first ask David to respond to that question. Then Doha, I would like your views on that one too, given it's for our younger audience.
So thanks for that question, and it is a really important question. There are lots of things that young people can do, and the simplest examples are in fact probably planting more plants that will take up carbon dioxide in their leaves, but particularly planting trees and avoiding chopping down any trees, because trees suck out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it away. And what we need to do is to look at ways to increase that. The other things we need to do is to think about everything we do that burns fossil fuels. So rather than driving or being driven in your family car to school, you need to try to use active transport, either by walking or riding a bicycle. You'll get fitter and you will save fossil fuels or stop fossil fuel emissions from that trip. And then finally, the most important thing is talk to other people. Talk to your parents, your grandparents, your neighbours about why you would like the climate that you're going to grow up to be more like the climate that was 30 years ago. You want to have a stable climate system, and to do that, not only yourself, but your parents, your grandparents, and your neighbours need to recognise that slowing and then stopping climate change is really important. Those three things are critically important.
Yeah, I would probably echo a lot of what David said. I think as a child, you're very much a part of the system. So you can make these individual changes, like riding your bike to school, eating more locally, eating less meats. But I guess the real contributions to climate change come from just existing within the system. So I think young people have a lot of power in starting those conversations with the adults in their life that encourage, the people in their life with money and influence to reduce their carbon emissions. So I would definitely encourage children to speak to their adults. And feel confident to have those one-on-one conversations that can influence the habits of the people around them.
So I've got another top rating question on Twitter, John.
Yep.
So for Cassandra, this one, it's a public policy question. Mm-hmm. So given the current pandemic and what we've heard about carbon emissions and the reduction of them, what can we learn and what can governments learn going forward about what's happened in this period that we might take on in the coming years?
And I think that's a really interesting question. And I think we also like to say that COVID has been unprecedented, but actually during the global financial crisis, we had another window of opportunity moment like this, where greenhouse gases and carbon emissions dipped because there was less economic activity, but we failed to take that opportunity. And I think one of the things that David has said is the importance of taking this opportunity. And that is a question about policy and government decisions. We currently have a political context in Australia where neither side of politics is offering us a real go at that opportunity. And so to bring that opportunity into light, actually we need people to make them do that. So the politics needs to influence the policy. Without the community demanding that we take this opportunity, the moment will be lost.
Okay.
So
What we
before I
also
interject
know
with another
is-
Twitter question, over to you, John.
Well, we have lots of questions coming through now for David and the panel, so I'll just pick some up quickly. Zoe asks, what changes can we make in everyday technology to lower our climate impact? I'll throw this one first to David.
Okay, thanks, John. And look, every piece of technology that we use, almost all of them are driven by electricity. They're certainly driven by energy, and they use energy. So what we've got to think about is trying to use the most efficient appliances, most efficient technology, so that they use less electricity and they use less energy. And so one of the best ways to reduce emissions is not necessarily to switch to new energy sources, but just to use things more efficiently, use more efficient appliances. That means using a car that consumes less fuel, but if you can, transition or transform to essentially electric vehicles. But it's true across many, many different areas that you can buy more efficient appliances in household appliances, and they will use less electricity. And not only will you reduce your emissions, you'll actually save your money, because the electricity that you typically consume charges money. If you use less of it, you will save money. So in terms of technologies, there are some very good old-fashioned technologies. You can use a handheld whisk rather than an electric mixing machine. You can use a bicycle for transport rather than a car. All of those, if you like, hand-driven devices or foot-driven devices will save you. They're slightly old-fashioned, but sometimes the old-fashioned devices may be just as effective and just need a coat of paint to make them look new again.
Okay. I've got quite a few questions coming in, so we'll see how many we can fit in the time we've got. Corinne asks, for both the whole panel and to David, what gives you hope that we will be successful in managing climate change at sustainable levels? Would you like to start with that?
Could you repeat the question?
What gives us hope that we can manage climate change at sustainable levels in the future?
Probably the science. So I think the work and the findings of scientists like David, they really do highlight that, contrary to what some people might believe, there is actually time to turn the ship around and start acting to mitigate the worst of the effects of climate change.
Cassandra?
Yeah, I think for me there are probably two things. One would be the changes in community attitudes and support over the last decade for mitigating climate change and the importance of meaningful adaptation. And the other would also be from the activist community. Many environmental activists that I've interviewed as part of my research, which is more than a decade now, used to say how important it would be for Australia to stop using so much coal and stop exporting coal and developing new coal, but felt that that was a conversation that could never be had in public, that this was something that could never be talked about. And if you look at the last 5 years in particular, that conversation is in the public now. It is a very real conversation, and one that is in small ways trying to be tackled in some parts of our policy making and political community.
Well, what gives me personally hope is the fact that we can vote. We can change politics with the power of the vote. And the other thing we can do, it's not just voting, it's it's getting the message across, and the message isn't just a science message. David and I have talked about this. It's a science plus humanities message. Science can provide answers to questions very easily, but none of those answers get put into action unless we engage rhetoric, law and policy, which are all humanities disciplines. So there has to be this merger, this collaboration between the sciences and humanities to get the solutions and get them into action. What do you think, David?
Look, I completely agree with that, John. But the other thing that gives me hope is what we've actually seen in the electricity supply systems, the massive transitions to the greater use of wind power and solar power across many parts of Australia. And South Australia is probably the best example of the transition from a purely fossil fuel driven electricity system to now there are many times when renewable electricity sources, particularly solar power and wind power, are providing more than 50% of the electricity used in South Australia. And so South Australia in that sense is a great example of what can be done, and more can be done in parts of Queensland and Northern Australia, because Australia as a country has more renewable energy potential from solar power and wind power than any other country in the world. We're blessed by enormous amounts of sunlight as well as lots of wind, better than any other country in the world. We can be a renewable energy superpower.
Can I just pick up on something you've said there, David? We all know about wind power harnessed through large sort of devices, but what about smaller household kind of wind energy devices? Are they far away? Are they available at the moment?
There are some that are available, but they're not as effective as the larger scale devices, because as we know, the wind gets stronger and stronger as you move up from the surface. And so the better devices in terms of harnessing electricity from natural sources are probably solar panels, or harnessing and purchasing wind power through many of the electricity suppliers will allow you to harness electricity or to partner in larger wind turbine systems through a cooperative. And there are many communities that are doing that and doing bulk purchases or allowing renewable energy, wind power, to be purchased in a cooperative approach.
Okay, thank you. A question has come in here from Tully. I think it's probably Tully Barnett, maybe, but I'm just guessing that. My question is for Cassandra Starr. What does your research tell us about the effects of communicating climate science to different communities? The science is clear. What's gone wrong with the message, the communication?
Yeah, and that picks up on something interesting, I think, that both Doha and David have mentioned as well, that the science is clear, and the science has been clear for some time. I mean, it has become better in terms of the models and the projections, etc. But the disconnect definitely is in terms of how we're getting that message to policymakers or politicians or the community. And it's not that we're not getting the message to them, though there are definitely some parts of the community that are sort of cautious about climate change and what we should do about it, or who are disengaged. It's a very small number who are unconvinced. But the larger challenge is while tackling climate change is in everybody's interest, everyone has conflicting interests and values. And some of those are deeply entrenched in our political system, in our political culture and our policymakers. So, for example, the perceived economic value of coal in the Australian economy is one of those. That's talked about significantly by our politicians. It's often overstated by our politicians and those in the minerals economy, but it is definitely the case that there are certain communities that are completely dependent on these resources. So it's not necessarily a failure of the communication, and it's not a failure of the science. It's our ability to pull apart, I think, the climate change problem from those other vested interests and find ways of tackling that.
Okay, thanks, Cassandra. I've got a question here that's come in now for for Doha, from Zoe, saying, how can we get involved with the climate movement here in Adelaide?
Well, there's a lot of avenues. If you're still in school, you can always send a Facebook message to School Strike for Climate, and that's our name on Facebook. Or if you're in university, there's a lot of environment clubs that feed into the activist movement more broadly in Adelaide, and they're always looking for new members, so definitely contact them.
And more broadly, you can contact your local council and your local political members and write to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
To be an activist, you don't need a team, you don't need a group. You know, even if you acting as just an individual, you know, takes the initiative to contact your local member, your local council, there's definitely a lot of potential to make change there. Yeah.
And we've got a couple of questions.
Let me add to that if I can,
Yep.
John, because the biggest, if you like, association in Australia is the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, or AYCC. It has branches in some schools and has speakers that come to schools, but it is specifically designed for both school members as well as university members. It runs training courses around climate information, as well as training courses, if you like, in giving presentations and talks around climate action. So it's a group that has branches in pretty well every city and almost every school and every university.
Okay, thanks. There's a couple of questions that have come in that are along similar themes, and one of them from Katerina Peters is about how much is the reduction in meat farming and transitioning to more plant-based diet important? And she quotes some research there from Poradell published in Science, said it would reduce the emissions by up to 60%. Is that, what do you know about that, David?
Look, the transition in diet is critically important in reducing meat, but it depends to a large extent on whether it is in an environment in which the meat production has been like is used in Europe or North America, where there's a lot of, how would I say, not natural grazing, but in fact fattening up of cattle and other animals. The critical ones in terms of meat production, the largest emitters are both cattle and sheep, and yes, they're popular in Australia. The emissions from those are critically important, but if we could transition to natural meat from kangaroos or poultry, the emissions associated with poultry use or from kangaroos are much smaller, because poultry production doesn't have the ruminant gut that leads to methane productions, and neither do kangaroos. So if we go to a greater poultry diet or we go to kangaroo meat, then we have a significantly reduced emissions. But yes, transitioning to a greater grain-based diet and vegetable diet is critically important, as long as you still retain your protein input from pulses and other protein containing vegetables.
I suppose it's important where we get our grains from because of the amount of water for things like rice grown in Australia. Should we be buying all our rice from Asia?
No, we should be trying to do it in areas where there's already high rainfall, and we should not also be trying to use the irrigated areas for water that's extracted from the Murray-Darling Basin and then using that for irrigation for rice. We should be using the existing high rainfall areas and then capturing that, but not using it in areas like what I would believe is some of the irrigation areas in the Murray, where it's better used for retaining the water for natural ecosystems.
Okay. Following on that theme of agriculture, there's a question here from Russell. How much importance do you think regenerative agriculture, or what other solutions may help us deal most with climate change?
Is that a question to me again, John?
I think so, yep.
Okay,
Unless
so
Cassandra
what
Yep.
Let me go first and then I'll pass it back to Cassandra and Doha. Look, regenerative agriculture is critically important because it seeks to, first of all, have a sustainable agricultural system so that the carbon content in the soils is increased over time, and that the use of both chemicals and fertilizers based on natural inputs, not on chemical inputs, and in effect, the vegetation stores are trying to enhance the fertility of the soil, not to deplete. What we do know in Australia is we've got dramatic declines in carbon and carbon content in the soils because we've lost a lot of the humus in the soils. And so the carbon content in the soils has declined, and that's led to a substantial loss of fertility in the soils across Australia.
Okay. Now, for Doha, there's a question from Colin Sterling. What do you think needs to be done to get people to listen and respond to these major issues in a meaningful way?
I think that's a question about messaging. So I think as activists, we need to start placing more emphasis on, I guess, the direct impacts that climate change is going to have on people's lives, their day-to-day lives, their day-to-day budgets. And we're seeing, new research every now and again that the economic impact felt by individuals is only going to grow as climate change intensifies, and that ranges from things like insurance. So I think just placing more emphasis on that part of the messaging.
Yeah. And another question that's come through for you, Doha, is could you tell us about what climate grief is?
Climate grief. Cassandra, do you want to start off on that one?
Or is that your area?
That is something I can comment on.
Cassandra.
So this is an idea that has evolved over, I guess, the last decade or so from an earlier idea of environmental grief that particularly younger people experience sadness and grief about the loss of environments and the loss of a stable climate and the loss of hope in many senses about what the future might be like under climate change.
All right. Okay. A few more questions. One from Paul Willis here. From his son, actually, Chester, how far can technology take us? Would one of you guys like to try that first before I throw back to David? Or we'll take it to David. All right.
Okay, look, I'm happy to have a go at that one. I'm also going to touch the previous one as well on climate grief because, look, one of the critically important issues to think about is, particularly for young people, we look at what I've talked about, we know that global warming is going to increase. Why would you want to try to continue to live in a world that you know is going to get hotter with more impacts when you haven't been the cause of the problem? It's essentially older people in developed countries that have caused this problem already over 100 years. And it's also an issue, particularly for women, that in terms of having children, is it reasonable to bring an extra child into this world that we know is going to be harder in terms of the impacts of climate change? In terms of climate grief, it's a really, really difficult question to try to say, is it fair and reasonable to bring people into the world? So look, that's a tough part. And then back to the other question, which has now slipped off the top of my mind, but I think, can you remind me, John, what was the other question, the more recent one?
Before the climate grief question.
No, the one after the climate grief question.
The one about
Technology.
the technology. It's from Chester, and he was asking about how far can technology take us to the solution.
We know that technology at present can take us in terms of electricity reductions, but we don't know how it can address a number of other critical issues. And for instance, we don't have the technologies yet that will allow us to produce zero emission food. We know that growing more plants can suck some carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but it's going to be really difficult to feed the growing global population without having ongoing emissions. So what we need is new technologies that will effectively suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere effectively, like carbon capture and storage, but we do not have efficient technologies that will do that. We need work on new technologies. And there's been efforts to do that at scale for more than 30 years, and we can't do it as effectively as plants do it continuously at present. So we need new technologies. And that means there's many opportunities for new jobs, new science, and new engineering to build these new technologies at scale.
Okay,
A really
thank you.
good documentary that really explores what a future with technology to make us more sustainable could look like is 2040. Has anyone heard of that? Yeah, so I definitely recommend having a watch of that one.
Okay, so I'm getting a message here to wrap up, but I'm sure we're allowed one last sort of question, and there's a question that's come from the audience that I think is a great one to finish up on, and it's basically asking both David and the panel, what are some small local stories of change and adaptation that inspire you? So I'll start with Cassandra.
Well, I guess for me, it's not such a small story, but South Australia's embrace of renewable energy, in particular for electricity generation, has been a big good news story.
Yep.
And I think for me, it's seeing political parties like Labor stand firm on their commitment to 50% renewable energy by 2030, despite their election loss. To me, that shows that the political institution is slowly recognizing that climate change, that there's a strong public mandate for climate action.
Yep. For me, it's just the huge support from the younger generations that are embracing climate change as a desperately important issue we need to do something about. And they're the ones that are coming into voting age soon, and they're the ones I think that the hope will rest with. David?
And John, you've stolen the thing that I was going to say as well, but I think re-emphasising, it's the schools strike for climate and the impact that one person, Greta Thunberg, could have energising millions of people around the world at schools, and then seeing the impact of the school strike for climate throughout Australia. If you can get politicians, conservative politicians, telling you that you need to stay in school because you're having too much of an impact, then you know that you're having a very powerful impact. Now, I know that that's not quite what the politicians were doing, but you actually learnt more about how politics works through the school strike for climate than you would ever have learnt in classroom lessons. So I congratulate people like Doha and the young people around the world who have demonstrated that the grey-haired men like myself cannot solve climate change unless we've got the communities working with us. And you showed us how to do that well.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, John, Doha, Cassandra and David. Look, that was a very interesting but also deep discussion, and I think that if we had all night, we'd be here to the early hours of the morning asking questions. And it did take us a little while to warm up on Twitter, no pun intended, but we're actually being bombarded with Twitter questions right now for our panel. So what we're going to be doing is packaging up tonight's event as a video that'll be available online, and we'll be putting a blog up in the next 24 hours where those questions which weren't answered, posted on Twitter. We will be seeking our panellists post-discussion tonight some answers to those burning questions. So please keep the conversation going. Now, traditionally, we present each of our panellists with a gift tonight to thank them for their time, not only tonight, but in preparing for an event like this. But each of them have actually asked that we make a donation instead to the charity Seed Indigenous Youth Climate Network. So Seed, so thank you. Seed is Australia's first network for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth advocating for climate justice. They work with the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, taking towards shaping a sustainable future with strong cultures and community. Now look, they're really easy to Google and their website is very informative, so please take the time to do that. At this point, I'm going to thank you all very much for for putting up with the technical glitch, we did get over it, and for making the time to come here tonight on what is a really important issue. I think we really only scratched the surface on the topic tonight. We will continue the conversation, and as you heard, Flinders University is very committed to this particular area. So please keep in touch with us and find out what we're doing and find out what some of our wonderful researchers are discovering and communicating to our community. Have a safe drive home or a walk home or a cycle home, depending on how you got here tonight. Thank you very much.